So I'm going to talk about using a modern night vision device for basically making some objects that are normally invisible, except to imaging, visible in real time. Enough that you can easily take a picture with a phone or something else. So just to start off with, this is a focuser and a coma corrector. This is a SIPS unit, but you could use an independent paracore. And this is the night vision device mounted in the focuser for observing use. And I'm going to talk about different ways it can be used. But first I want to thank Peter Wang. He's a very experienced night vision experimenter, and he loaned me some devices in the past to experiment with. So there's his website if you want to take a quick picture. He's got some interesting stuff there. I just have sort of a blog kind of going just with multiple entries of what I've been doing with night vision, but he's got a little more background and information on where to get devices and that sort of thing. If you're having trouble hearing, just move on up. There's plenty of room. You can even drag the chairs up further. I don't care. This is about as loud as I can yell, so if you can hear me, great. All right, so we'll move on. By the way, that's my 20-inch f3 telescope in the background. As it turns out, fast telescopes are actually well suited for night vision astronomy for some reasons I'll get into. So night vision, as they call it, you might see it abbreviated NVD, night vision device sometimes. It's basically converting photons that come in into a lot more photons, and then using those to form an image that's easily seen, typically on a phosphor screen, and then that's imaged by some other optics. Thermal imaging is different. I don't know if anybody here has played with thermal cameras or thermal sights for weapons. Different technology, longer wavelengths, still lets you see at night, but in a different way. I'll show some comparisons. It's basically looking at heat, and it is not night vision like I'm talking about. Both, you can see them in real time. There's a real-time display on a screen. So it's basically a video. And that's what makes it really interesting. Instead of sitting there and waiting for a picture to download, you can actually move the scope around in real time and see the image move and look for faint structures like you would shake a telescope normally to help you see a fainter object. You can do that with night vision as well. Right now, the CCD devices aren't quite as sensitive, but they may catch up. I don't know. I'm not sure what the limits of that technology are. There are several competing technologies now, but we're going to talk about night vision, which is basically a photo multiplier tube, somewhat in the traditional sense, but the modern versions of that. So why do we need night vision? Well, here's a scale of basically brightness. So direct sunlight, we're going to call it about 100,000, or actually I think it's a million. I think they lost a zero there. I'm not actually sure. I grabbed this off of another source. An overcast day like this, let's say we've got a brightness of about 1,000 lux, roughly. As we get into the full moon, it's about 0.1 lux, so about a 10,000th as much. We get down to starlight only, it's about 1,000th of a lux. And if it's overcast like it was the last few nights, depending on how much light pollution is around, it's even darker, 10 times darker at about a 10,000th of a lux. So we're going to try and bring that starlight illuminated scene up to something that's visible by amplifying it by over 10,000 times. That's what the new devices do. And they do it very well. So here's a comparison of night vision, which is the classic green. Now, nowadays, some of them are white phosphor, so you don't get that classic green look. Kind of depends on what you prefer and what you want to spend. And then on the right is a thermal image, the black and white, where basically the blacker it is, the hotter it is. So we've got a light amplified image in the green and a thermal image in the black and white. Here they've flipped the scales on the thermal, and now white is warmer or hotter. You can see the person. But in the night vision, they kind of blend in because we're just amplifying the light. So camouflage still works for that. If you've got feral hogs like they do down south in Texas, I don't know if they've got those around here or not, and you like to blow them away at night, the thermal sight's great. You can see the hogs. There's a lot of great videos on YouTube if you like to watch that sort of thing. It's kind of entertaining if you're in that kind of mood. Watch them take out about 100 hogs in about 2 minutes. I'm exaggerating there. And then below, the same scene in night vision. with the hogs shown as dark outlines. They don't stand out as well, but you can still see them. So infrared needs special coatings, and the wavelengths are very long, and we don't actually get that much infrared out of the sky into the wavelengths that these cameras are going to see. So you're not going to see anything if you point it at the sky generally. But if we amplify the light that's coming from the sky, we can see some really interesting stuff. This began in World War II when the Germans developed some night vision systems. They did require a big-ass infrared illuminator to light up the battlefield. And the thing was, those trucks that they were on could be seen and could be destroyed pretty easily. So while it may have given them a small advantage in certain circumstances, overall, it wasn't working so well. Are you getting it? Getting the microphone? Okay. So that was the very first bit, and it's evolved since then. So you've actually got a rifle with a night vision scope on it, and maybe even an infrared light on it to help illuminate the target. Thankfully, we won that war. So now we have generation 0, 1, 2, 3, and we're going to just basically talk about 0 and 1 in the sense that they're the classic photomultiplier tube. And one thing I want to point out is the light actually comes in to this photocathode up here, and then it comes down through, and it actually, the electrons flip. So you actually get an inverted image out of it. And nowadays they do that a little bit differently. So this is the old style. They've got a giant potential between the photocathode and the other end of the tube, and the electrons want to fly off. And if you hit it with one electron, you get many onto the screen, and that's basically how it's amplified. I'm just going to gloss over it. And then you have another lens out here, an eyepiece, that images, that allows you to see the image on the phosphor screen. So the electrons hit the phosphor screen, they make photons, and you can see it. And the phosphor is designed such that the light decays pretty quickly. It's not like your classic glow-in-the-dark where it lasts a long time. This only lasts a small fraction of a second. So you actually can get an image that's moving. It isn't, there for a while. You don't have to wait for it to go away. So that's how the phosphor is designed. Now the generation 2 and the generation 3 are built a little bit different. They have a photocathode up here, and then they have what's called a microchannel plate, which is another electron amplifier, basically. The light hits the photocathode, the photons hit that, make electrons, the photocathode amplifies a bit, and then it goes into the microchannel plate, which is a series of channels. I'll show that a little bit. But basically it makes even more electrons, so it's kind of two stages of amplification, so you get even more gain. And then it hits a phosphor screen that's right here on top of this fiber optic twist inverter. So it's a bunch of fiber optics that rotate the image 180 degrees to give you an upright image. That's how they do the inversion now instead of doing it inside the tube. So here's sort of a cutaway. We have the objective lens out here. We have the image tube's pretty small in here, and then the fiber twist is actually reasonably thick because they literally take hot fiber optics and twist them so that those many, many, many tiny fiber optics guide the light and invert it, and then it hits a screen and you can see it. So here's some little different versions of the fiber optic inverter just to see them out. Some are sort of rectangular, some are round. That was something that kind of fascinated me. I didn't even know those were inside the units, but that's how they get the image inversion done. And actually you can see they have lines per millimeter. In certain devices, that can be what limits the resolution. It just depends on how it's all put together. So here's your modern version. You've got a photocathode out here. You've got your microchannel plate. And you've got your phosphor creating the light. And the fiber brings that out to a concave surface that the eyepiece can focus on, and you can actually see the image. So you're actually looking in these things. You're looking through fiber optics to get back to the phosphor screen. And that's a little diagram of the microchannel plate. The idea is to have the electrons go in at an angle, so they kind of bounce down, and there's a cascade of even more and more electrons created that come off, and that allows you to get even more amplification. So why are we talking about this now and not earlier? Well, people have been using this since the 80s for astronomy, but nowadays with the Generation 3 devices, we've got a lot of gain, and we can have fun in certain ways that we couldn't before. Before it was kind of restricted to certain objects that it worked well with. Now we can add narrowband filters, like those you may have just been talking about for your imaging purposes. We can put one of those on the front of one of these units and actually see stuff. We're talking about a 6 nanometer bandwidth narrowband filter. So they're not cheap, but what it does is cuts out a lot of the extraneous light, just like with imaging, and you can actually see a lot of detail within that band. So there are some restrictions depending on what part of the spectrum you're in. Some of the devices tend to respond more in the longer wavelengths. Typically that's what we're going to be talking about, like H-alpha. Oxygen 3, not so much. It just depends on the object and how bright it is. So I tend to make fast optics in the mirrors that I make, and as it turns out, there's an advantage to having fast optics with these devices, so that's kind of why I've been playing with them. I have a 20-inch f3 Newtonian, I've got a 14.5-inch f2.55, and I use those both visually with night vision, and it's a lot of fun. I'll show some pictures later on. So this is sort of the improvement in the various night vision programs as sort of they were developed by the military. I won't go into this too much, but I will point out signal to noise, which if you're an engineer, this is just a ratio here. It took me a long time to find that out. Gone from 16, in this chart it goes to 28, but now we have tubes that are in the upper 30s for signal to noise ratio. So that continues to go up. You have improved modulation transfer functions at different resolutions, so basically sharper images and better images. And that's about all I'm going to cover on that chart, or else we'll get in really deep.
As I look at, we're talking about like 20 plus years.
Yeah.
The gains seem relatively modest compared to the gains in, say, microelectronics. These are.
Yeah, the gain is listed there, and
all the improvements.
That's sort of the upper gain, but the noise has been lowered.
Signal to noise, gain,
yeah.
MTF, they all seem to have improved a little, but I'm just surprised that over this period of time.
Well, this doesn't include the last generation, the latest generation. But this is just sort of the improvement. I wanted to show some numbers for people who are interested. So this is what one of these looks like. I've got one right here. This is Generation 3 monocular. It's got battery cover here, which is this, and this is a gain control. There is a manual gain control on many of these units now, which is really handy. The old ones didn't have that. They'd sort of do an automatic thing, but you can control the gain. If you turn it up too high, of course, you get noise and scintillation. Some people don't care. I don't care too much. If you turn it down, it maybe makes a little bit nicer but dimmer image. But you can control that. So it's got an objective lens on the front. It's very fast. It's only got an aperture of about 1 inch, but this is about an f1.2 lens. And the idea is basically the faster the lens in front of this thing, the brighter the image is. So at some point, there's a compromise between optical quality for such a fast lens, but this is what they chose in the design and production of these units. Then there's an eyepiece here. I don't have the eye cup on because I'm going to show some other things. And these can be mounted in pairs, of course, for your classic night vision goggles that you'll see the military use or see them on too many TV shows. And that's basically the unit. It doesn't weigh too much. You put a lanyard on it, so you put it around your neck so you don't drop it because they're not cheap. In order to get this in the focuser, I had to actually take this adapter and machine out this little groove to help it miss part of the battery cover. We're trying to get the unit down inside the focuser as far as possible to minimize the in-travel that's required. So right now we're still sort of in the infancy of using it, and thank you. And so we're learning things like this, like we need a little bit more in travel for this particular mode of observing, which is called prime focus, where we're using the unit without its objective lens here. On this unit, I can't remove the objective lens because it's nitrogen purged. So we have to go about this a different way, and I'll get to that in a sec. But as is, with about 1 inch focal length lens, it acts like a with a 26 millimeter eyepiece, it acts like basically a 26 millimeter eyepiece. So you can compute your magnification very easily. However, it's a fixed eyepiece. You can't change magnification. with this unit if you're not using the lens, if you're just using it as an eyepiece in prime focus. So I just went over a few of these things. Sorry for the green, I think I can read it. It acts like an eyepiece. This is the simplest system. You have the least glass to go through, so you may get a slightly brighter image than in other configurations. You have to take off the lens to actually do this, but it is the minimum weight hanging off the focuser. Now, for those of us with big honkin' focusers or SIPS units, we just don't care. But for some, for smaller telescopes with cheaper focusers, this might be the way to go. If you've got a little telescope with an 1.25" focuser and it's fairly fast, you might look at using the prime focus viewing method. And we're done with that. So we have another method called afocal. And I'll demonstrate this. This is a crude thing off of Wikipedia. You have your little telescope lens out here. You have a focuser with an eyepiece in it, and then you connect the camera with its lens to look into the eyepiece. And there's a diagram there. Basically, it's sort of like looking in the eyepiece, but with a camera. And you can do this if you space everything properly. So here we have from the TeleVue website, we have the objective lens here, or a mirror, it doesn't matter, your telescope, it could be a reflector. And here's the focal plane right here. So that's where the image forms. That's where you put your CCD camera. But if you're using an eyepiece, that's where the eyepiece image is from. So the eyepiece takes this image and magnifies it and makes it so you can see it and look around in the field of view and actually observe. So we want to get, this is the exit pupil of the eyepiece right here. So if you know what an exit pupil is, it's basically the size of the pupil of light that's coming out of the eyepiece. And we know that our eyes have a maximum, the pupil has a maximum diameter of about 6 or 7 millimeters, maybe a little bit smaller depending on age. So in the classic telescope, if we get a pupil that's bigger than that, we're going to actually lose light. And things are going to look a little bit weird. We'll have maybe have some weird shadows or whatever. However, with night vision, this lens is 1 inch in diameter and will accept almost that big of an exit pupil. So all those restrictions are gone if we use one of these to look into the eyepiece. That's the advantage here. I use a 50 millimeter Plossl in a very fast scope with this coupled to it, and I'll show you how I do that in a minute. But you can do that, you get all that light, and you get much lower power than you could visually. So that's a big advantage. The thing is, with the eyepiece that you're using, you need to have about 20 millimeters of eye relief here. So lower power eyepieces typically have this, but you have to be careful with your eyepiece choices if you want to use it with one of these units. You need that eye relief. So here's how this whole arrangement looks. We've got our telescope here, we've got our eyepiece here, and we've got a special adapter to connect the night vision unit to. So I'm just going to show you how this works. This is a unit, a little adapter unit made by Tactical Night Vision Company. You carefully thread it on. There are threads on the inside of the lens housing that accept this, and it threads on there. Then for TeleVue eyepieces that work with the dioptrics, what we do is we take off the eye cup, just like using a dioptrics. Does anybody use a dioptrics for astigmatism? Yep. Same thing. Put this over this. Actually, I got to loosen it up. And then tighten it back down. And it locks into that ring. And now these are one piece. And this is what we have here. So now I could put this into a telescope and I'd have the 50 millimeter Plossl and I'd be looking at it with the night vision unit. So this is called afocal, as I mentioned before. Now if you want to change powers, you just change eyepieces. Easy, just like observing normally. So you can get different magnifications with this setup. You can put the filter either on the end of the eyepiece in the filter threads, like right here, or you can put it on your filter slide that's just under the eyepiece or the coma corrector, or however your scope's set up. We are limited by the night vision device itself to about a 40-degree field of view looking into the eyepiece. which is actually not a bad thing because a lot of the wide field eyepieces aren't the greatest at the edge, especially when you use them with a fast scope. So that's not such a big deal. This 50 Plössl, I think, only has a field of view at 50 degrees, so we're not losing too much. It works fine. But if you've got these really wide angle, expensive eyepieces, you're not going to get all that field into the night vision device, but you will get more magnification maybe. We do need that 20 millimeters of eye relief roughly, and we have to move that night vision adapter between eyepieces in the dark, which you get used to quickly, but you know, it's just one of those things you have to do. It's like tuning a paracord. You got to remember to do it or take the time to do it. And of course, this taller stack sticks out of the focuser a bit. So you got to make sure you have a reasonably strong focuser and have it secured properly. I've actually put a parafocalizing ring on the 50 Plössl here to help this come to focus at about the same place as other eyepieces. So this is just a little tweak I made because I'm using it a lot and I was having to pull it out of the focuser to get it to come to focus. Depends on the focus travel of your focuser. So if you want to see the stack that's longer than the telescope, we look at the little TeleView 60 here, little TV 60. So here we have a diagonal, we've got a 32 millimeter Plössl, we've got the adapter, and then we've got the night vision unit, and they also make a phone adapter. So you can just take an image with your phone. And that image on the right is from a 32-inch telescope at the last Winter Star party. Just shot with a phone really quick. It actually looked better in person, of course. But it's just a quick phone shot of the interior of the Orion Nebula. So you can do better with a little better camera. What I actually do is I have a little point and shoot. I have a Canon G15 that'll shoot in RAW, so it's a good quality camera, but it's a point and shoot. And literally, when I turn that on, the lens comes out and there's a flat surface on the front of the lens. I was going to grab the camera, but I forgot. But I can literally put up right up against this flat surface here and just hold it there, and I can take a 1-second exposure with no problem. And I'm going to show some of those later. So really crude, but the reason I did that was not to take a picture. It was kind of to show people at a talk like this what you can actually see with your eye. So I tried to have the image be approximately what you saw with your eye. But let's talk about what we're going to see at 1 power. So I'm going to remove this for a second. Just going to unthread it. Comes off that quick. Normally I'd have the eye guard on here. And basically what you do is you turn it on, you hold it up, and you look. And you're looking at 1 power. So if you have 2 of these things, that's why the military guys can function with these. You can literally walk around like it's daylight and not be disoriented, and there's not too much distortion in the image. That's another criteria for designing these fast lenses. Makes them not simple. You can just walk around with no, you're not going to get sick or anything like that like you would looking through other devices if you're trying to walk around and navigate at night. So the first thing you can do is if you're at a star party, you can spy on everybody around you in the dark, see what they're doing, see what they're drinking, what they're eating, what they're, whether they're on their ladder or not. And that's kind of neat, but it also helps you to walk around. I'll tell us. Well, I discovered one thing I wasn't expecting at Okie-Tex. I was just looking around the field to see, what would actually show up. And I saw this really bright light. And I walked over. It was down the field a ways. And it was bright in the night vision device. As it turns out, when I got up close, it was somebody's camper with an infrared illuminator for a security camera. So you can see that. And I don't know, I was going to ask the imager guys how much that affects actual imaging.
We usually have an infrared filter on it, so luminance cuts off the infrared.
Okay. It was bright, so I was curious if anybody wasn't using, the proper filter, if they might actually get their images fucked. But you can see stuff like that, so you can see where some of these security cameras are. And then when you start looking at the sky without a filter, of course you see a million more stars than you could without this thing. Everything's amplified. You get roughly a 4 magnitude improvement in the stars that you can see. Roughly. Depends on conditions and the device. And so just looking at the Milky Way in the sky under a dark sky without a filter is a lot of fun. The Milky Way, even in town, a lot of stuff shows up. Dark nebulae start to pop out just on their own, just at 1 power depending on the size. But if we add on an H-alpha filter, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, they're not cheap, but I prefer either 6 or 12 nanometer bandwidth. The 6 is probably the best under my skies, which are a little bit light polluted, not super dark. Not quite as dark as this, but pretty good. Then you start to see things with your own eyes in real time, like Barnard's Loop, the Rosette Nebula, North American, the California Nebula is a piece of cake. Down in the Keys, the Vela supernova remnant popped out. The Heart and Soul and other large nebula that show off in H alpha, you can just see them just with this monocular and this narrowband filter. So no other equipment is required, and these objects show up even in light pollution if you use the filter, just like imaging. So, like with film and with CCDs, a faster telescope is going to give us basically a brighter image. So there's an advantage there to having a very fast instrument. We start changing things a little bit when we put this onto an eyepiece. And I won't go into that too much, but I will say that with the larger exit pupil, as long as you can still get the whole exit pupil into the objective, you're going to get all that light. So you want a fast scope, you want a long focal length eyepiece that works with the unit, and you can have a lot of fun. So large fast reflectors, like I was talking about, 20-inch f3 or even faster, works very well. And I'm going to illustrate now what a lot of the imagers know, but as you get faster, your image gets brighter, basically. I'll show this one quick slide that I try to use to illustrate this. If this is a part of the sky, right here in an 8-inch f3, we have this is the part of the sky in a 16-inch f3. So it's magnified, but we'll just call that the airy disk of the star. It's the same size, because as the telescope gets larger, the airy disk decreases. But in this case, we've increased the magnification. So basically that size looks the same. So at f3 and f3, the brightness is the same, the brightness of the image. We just get more magnification out of the 16-inch, the actual brightness per unit area. Now if we take this 8-inch f3 and we make it f4.24, then we've actually increased to twice the area of the image. We've magnified it a little bit, and what that does is halve the brightness of the image. So this is why, for those who are not imagers, you see this factor of 1.4. That's the scaling factor there. That's also a factor that's used to choose camera f-stops, and that was an easy way to calculate when you would have your brightness and have to double your exposure back when you were doing manual exposures and calculations. Yeah.
2 seconds.
Okay. So fast is good, but everything's a trade-off. I'm going to skip over a bit of this. Now, of course, as you magnify more, depending on the object, you may see more detail, but the brightness is going to drop off, so you might not see as much of the object. You kind of have to experiment and see. I'm tending to prefer this eyepiece or maybe a 41 panoptic with the telescopes that I have. I've even gone up to into the 20s and the Naglers and some of the Delos, like the Delos 17. That's probably about the maximum magnification I'm using right now. What I hope to do is try this out on some of the more memorable planetary nebula that you can see during this event and see how that works at higher magnification and whether or not I can use a narrowband O3 filter as well and see some stuff, or if still the H alpha works better. So again, we're still kind of learning how all this works, and we don't quite understand everything yet. Here are some of the response curves that I've found online, and it's kind of confusing. So this is spectral response. So we have the visual range roughly here, whereas these units respond more to longer wavelengths. That's why you could see that infrared illuminator. So we don't know exactly, that's what I was talking about before, maybe the oxygen 3, which is more of a green-blue wavelength, doesn't show up quite as well with these devices because they may not respond as well in that part of the spectrum at this time. It just depends on the device, and sometimes there are even filters they put in for specific purposes when you're using these devices. So we just don't know right now what's going on. O3 is maybe just out of range. H alpha works great. Silicon might work. Methane has been used to take pictures of Saturn that are kind of cool when where part of the planet and the rings are glowing. And so the narrow bandwidth, as with imaging, we want to pick out one narrow area of this and get as much signal as possible. There's a lot of signal at H-alpha wavelengths, whereas we're going to then be able to amplify that over the background sky brightness in that particular band. So sometimes sensitivity to blue and green lasers is a bad thing, or it's a good thing depending on the military use. They might be marking a target, or it might be an aircraft interior where the lights are just too bright at a particular color, and they want the goggles to respond to what's outside of the cockpit rather than what's inside. So there are different ways to set these up and different ways to use them, and I won't go into it too much more. Here are some pictures. Now, this doesn't look too bad on the screen. It's your typical difference between a projector screen and a laptop screen. You see a little bit more. But we have the flame nebula right here and the horse head. You can see the little notch for the horse head right here. This is a capture of a video that's on YouTube that this user posted, JDV Astro. You can look that up if you want to see some neat videos. And this is pretty typical what you'd see with your eye, depending on the magnification you use. I think this is probably, well, this is 8x. So he's got an 8x lens in front of it, or some arrangement that gives about 8 power rather than 1. Here's the California Nebula. I'm going to show some images I have of this later. Just looking at it right there. North American. I have a better image of part of this. There's Saturn in the methane band with that amplification. Again, this is stuff, I don't know anybody else who's done this. There are a lot of things that haven't been looked at with certain filters. Here's a nice view of the rosette. This is a 20-second exposure with a camera actually looking into the night vision unit itself. So that's an example of what you can do with not that much time. Here's Barnard's Loop, right out here. Again, you can just see this with 1x. Here's the flame and the horse head. So the one thing that you sort of give up using these things is you're going to lose some dark adaptation, basically, because you're looking into this amplified thing at night when it's dark. So that's a given. Cost can range, depending on if you buy something used or on eBay or whatever, from about $1,000 to $4,000 for one of these units. But you know, you're getting a 4 magnitude gain, and you can start to see stuff with the narrowband filter. So if you like to do that, it may be worth it for you. The filters, as a lot of you know, $100 to $500 a piece. We don't need the highest end filters. Like, I find that 3 nanometers is just too narrow for these devices, and they start to starve for photons. 6 is about right. 12 under dark skies might work extremely well. I got to do that comparison again. They're easy to carry around. I mean, here's your device. Just carry it around, put it on your telescope. These, however, are ITAR controlled. You can't export them, and you're not allowed to sell them to someone outside the U.S. or be possessed by a non-American citizen at this point. The older generations can be, and there's another company called Photonis that also makes tubes in Europe. And I've actually used some of them. They're not quite as good as these, but they're close. So those are available in Europe and in other countries, and hopefully Australia and places like that. So if you buy one, be careful. You can't take it out of the U.S. territory. Peter Wang has been talking about taking a trip to Guam for this reason, because it is a U.S. territory and it's about as far south as he could figure out how to get to see the southern sky stuff. And it will change you. This is a warning when you use one of these things. Proceed at your own risk. Know what you're getting into. You might have way too much fun, and enjoy seeing this stuff in real time. So we're getting that 4 magnitudes, and you're increasing your aperture by a factor of roughly 6 instantly. We are not gaining resolution, though. We're actually losing a little bit, typically. And I'm all about quality of optics. So if you want the most detailed view, of course, we're not going to use this for planets typically, unless you want to see the methane emission of Jupiter, Saturn, or something like that. So aperture is the only way to really get resolution, and that's why we come to Florida to observe, to see higher magnifications and to see objects further south. So You can't replace a big telescope with this, but you can use this with one and have a hell of a lot of fun with it. We've used it on up to a 32-inch telescope, and just amazing stuff starts showing up. We've just scratched the surface of what you can see. One night I was just kind of, like I say here, I was cruising down Marcharian's chain with my 20-inch f3 and just looking at the little bits of personality in each galaxy that were just so simple to see compared to having to tease it out and sit there and stare at it for a good period of time. So for those of us who have lots of stuff to do like me, I had fun doing this. It's not going to replace classic observing, but it's certainly going to supplement it. We can mostly skip this. Here's some of my images. That is the Mexico portion of the North American Nebula. Again, just shot with like a 1/2 or 1 second exposure with this point-and-shoot camera, literally held up to that eyepiece on that device right there. So that's the little Mexico trunk that comes off. The Gamma Cygni region. And I'm switching. Some of these are with my 20-inch f3. Some are with the 14.5-inch f2.55, depending on which one I liked better. Pac-Man 281. Nice visually, but very nice with this. This is the interesting half of the veil, as I say. And I can't remember which scope that was with. I wanted to fit it all in there. But, you know, all easy to see, just like that. Here is part of the California Nebula. Probably with the 14.5. It won't all fit in that field of view, but there it is. You can see the filaments. And there's the 2 scopes in my driveway. I got the 14.5 up on a stand there to get it up to a convenient viewing height because the thing's only this long. And my 20-inch f3. And I think that is it. So thank you. There's some links to other people's websites and videos. I'll leave that up.